Greetings, viewer. Don't forget to visit my website for links to support the production of these works if you value what I'm doing. I appreciate any help you can offer. Thank you for having a look and a listen. Yours, John Loth. The Evolution of Civilizations by Carroll Quigley. Read by John Loth. Chapter 6. The Matrix of Early Civilizations. Part 1. We have already said that civilizations are like crystals, which are frequently distorted by efforts to share the same crystalline material. They are also distorted by the non-crystalline material, or matrix, in which they are embedded. The matrix source from which diamonds are derived is great cylindrical pipes of febrile blue clay that rise vertically from the remote depths of the earth to just below the surface. In this clay, the diamonds are found embedded like currants in a fruit cake. Of course, the diamonds in a pipe of blue clay are much less frequent than the currants in any acceptable piece of cake. In this, they are like civilizations, which are very infrequent occurrences in a matrix of time, space, and non-civilized cultures. The matrix in which civilizations occur is five-dimensional, just as culture is. These include the same three dimensions of space, the fourth dimension of time, and the fifth dimension of abstraction. Before we make any serious attempt to apply the 7 stages of civilization, we should have a somewhat clearer idea of this matrix in order to understand the distorting influences it may exercise on the 7 stages of normal evolution in a civilization. The 3 dimensions of space in which a civilization is found include its geographic environment. Since we are primarily interested in our own Western civilization and its direct predecessors rather than in the New World or the Far Eastern civilizations, we shall speak here only of the geographic matrix in which Western civilization arose. This area, including Europe, Northern Africa, and Western Asia, was aptly called the Northwest Quadrant by the historian James Henry Breasted. Bounded on the south by the Sahara Desert, along the line of latitude 20 degrees north, and on the east by the northeast running line of the Pamir, Tian Shan, and Altai Mountains. Its western and northern frontiers are formed by the great arc of the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. Within this great quadrant, the landmass of Afro-Eurasia has the form of a letter L, which has been rotated in a clockwise direction a quarter turn. The apex of this figure lies in the northwest, in Europe, while one limb runs eastward into Asia, and the other limb runs southward into Africa. Europe's position at the apex of these 2 lines has made it a mixing area, with the African influences more important in the prehistoric period, and the Asiatic influences more important in the historic period. This mixing role of Europe has been modified also by the extreme diversity of Europe's terrain, which has given it a very convoluted coastline, creating numerous inland seas and semi-isolated valleys that give on to the sea. The result of these 2 geographic influences has been to give Europe great diversity of both geographic conditions and cultural influences in a small area. The Northwest Quadrant falls into 3 zones: flatlands in the north and south, being separated by the east-west spine of the Highland Zone. The Highland Zone is a broken sequence of mountains and plateaus from the Pyrenees through the Alps, Apennines, Balkan Highlands, Carpathian Mountains, Anatolian Plateau, Caucasus, and Iranian Plateau, to the Himalayas and the line of highlands that form the eastern boundary of the Northwest Quadrant. North of this highland zone lie the northern flatlands, which begin as a narrow wedge in the Netherlands and run eastward across the Northwest Quadrant, widening steadily as they move eastward, so that they are only a couple of 100 miles wide in Western Europe, but broaden to almost 2,000 miles wide in Asia. The southern flatlands are opposite in pattern to the northern flatlands, since they are broadest in the extreme west and are narrower in northeastern Africa and Arabia, finally falling below sea level in the extreme east to form the bottoms of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. This simple and oversimplified three-zone pattern of the northwest quadrant is complicated by a number of other features, of which the most obvious are the inland seas, rivers, and mountain passes. One of the chief of these features is the Mediterranean Sea, which runs east and west just south of the highland zone. The geographic significance of the Mediterranean Sea, of course, is that it divides Europe from Africa. But its cultural significance is distinctly different, because it has served to link its shores together rather than to divide them. This binding influence of the Mediterranean in the cultural sphere lasted for over 4,000 years, from the first establishment of distant maritime travel about 3,500 BC to the Arab conquest of North Africa and the Near East about AD 700. During this period, the techniques of water transportation were far more efficient and cheaper than the techniques of land travel. This superiority of movement by water continued for more than 1,000 years after the Arab conquest, the technological lag of land travel beginning to close only with the invention of the macadam road, the coach, and the railroad after 1750. In the 1,000 or more years after 700, the linking influence of superior maritime communication in the Mediterranean was counterweighed by the cultural division between Muslim culture on its southern and eastern shores and Christian culture on its northern and western shores. But in the 4,000 years before the Arabic conquest, the technological factor was not counteracted by any profound cultural differences, and the shores tended to be drawn together by marine communication into a single cultural system. At that time, the cultural division was not along the Mediterranean Sea, but on the mountain barrier running parallel to it, to the north. Classical civilization, especially as it grew into the Roman Empire, was the culmination of these influences. They were reflected in the term our sea, Mare Nostrum, applied by the Romans to the Mediterranean, while the peoples north of the mountains, who were biologically closer relatives but culturally remote, were called barbarians for most of the classical period. Less obvious than the Mediterranean were other geographical features of the northwest quadrant, especially those serving as interregional connections. Of these links, two of the more significant were the Syrian Saddle and the Vardar to Morava route. The Syrian Saddle is the low pass across the Lebanon and the anti-Lebanon mountains, around the northern edge of the Syrian desert, just at the point where the Euphrates River approaches closest to the Mediterranean Sea. The mountains and deserts surrounding this saddle make it the only feasible route connecting the Aegean, the Mediterranean, and Egypt to the west, with Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf to the east. In a similar fashion, the Vardar to Morava River valleys provide a route that joins the Aegean Sea near Salonika with the middle Danube. The importance of these two links can be seen in the fact that such significant innovations as metallurgy, alphabetic writing, and Christianity came to Europe by way of the Syrian Saddle and the Mediterranean, while the knowledge of agriculture first came to Europe north of the mountains by way of the Vardar to Morava Valley. We have already said that the first civilization began in Mesopotamia before 5000 BC, when people of the Neolithic garden cultures moved from the highland zone down into the alluvial valley and were able to create permanent settlements because of the refertilizing function of the annual floods. These people are known as Sumerians. They were distinguished by two significant features. Physically, they were rather stocky, round-headed people who seemed to have worn closely clipped hair and no beards. And linguistically, they spoke an agglutinative language related to Elamite, Hurrian, and other highland zone languages, but not related either to the inflected Indo-European languages then forming on the northern flatlands, or to the inflected Semite languages already formed on the southern flatlands, Arabia. The difference in language between the highland zone peoples and their neighbors in the flatlands to the north and the south, at least in Western Asia, was also reflected in a difference of physical type. The peoples of both flatlands tended to be long-headed, wore long hair and beards, and were less stocky in bone structure. The peoples of the southern flatlands, Semite speakers, were less tall and darker in eye, hair color, and complexion than the peoples of the northern flatlands. The Proto-Indo-European speakers. This sandwich-like arrangement of peoples on the triple-zoned terrain of Western Asia seems to have existed when Mesopotamian civilization was first beginning in the centuries before 5000 BC and was still in existence 2,000 years later, say 3300 BC, when the invention of writing and of bronze making marked the shift at almost the same time from the prehistoric to the historic period, and from the Chalcolithic or copper stone age to the Bronze Age. In fact, the sandwich-like appearance of Western Asia was, if anything, increased by 3300 BC, because by that later date the highland-zoned peoples remained agriculturalists in the double sense we have indicated, while both the Semites to the south and the Proto-Indo-Europeans to the north had adopted the care of domestic animals, but not the planting of crops, and had become pastoral peoples. There were other, less dramatic evidences of this sandwich arrangement. For example, both flatland dwellers tended to be warlike and patriarchal, and in religion emphasized the power of masculine sky gods, while the highland dwellers tended to be more peaceful, more matriarchal, and had as their chief deity a goddess of fertility and sex who resided in the earth. This triple pattern of language, physical type, and social customs must not, of course, be made too rigid. A certain amount of mixture and confusion of the pattern must have existed at all times. But there can be no doubt that some such patterns as this did exist on the three-zoned terrain of Western Asia along the line of longitude 45 degrees east at the moment when the invention of writing in Mesopotamia marked the advent of the historic period in human history and the clear establishment of the first civilization. One of the principal tasks of Old World history is to find some explanation of this sandwich pattern of human society at the dawn of history. This can be done to some extent by the triple pattern of geographic terrain, but while such explanation may be helpful in respect to social customs, it is not completely satisfactory there, and is completely inadequate in explaining the distribution of languages or of physical types of men. Accordingly, explanation based on geographic factors must be supplemented by inferences regarding the events of the prehistoric period before 3000 BC. In making such inferences, we have the evidence supplied by archaeology, but this in turn must be interpreted in terms of the sandwich pattern to be found in the later historic period. Unfortunately, the areal and chronological specialization of most archaeologists and ancient historians has hampered them in making such inferences or even in realizing the need for them. Before we present our own inferences on this matter, we should be quite clear what it is that we are seeking to do. We are trying to explain the distribution of languages, physical types, and social customs of Western Asia as the matrix in which the earliest and later civilizations of that area appeared. Specifically, we wish to explain the pattern of these along the line of 45 degrees, east longitude, just before 3000 BC. This pattern can be summed up in the table on page 165. Some of this pattern can be explained in terms of fairly obvious geographic and social factors. The archaeological record shows that the earliest agriculturalists were highland zone peoples who had both domestic animals, goats, sheep, and cattle, and crop planting, at a time when the dwellers in both flatlands were still hunters. The earliest peasants were peaceful because there was a supply of adequately watered land available for occupation by the limited numbers of peasants, without any need to fight for it. Moreover, these earliest gardeners engaged in hoe culture, without plows, which was originally a female activity at a time when males continued to hunt. Later, as the development of sedentary life made hunting dwindle in significance, men became animal tenders. But the food for both the men and their animals was a female product. Furthermore, the shift from hunting to agriculture provided a rising and more secure standard of living that made possible, as well as desirable, an increase in population. This was also produced by females. The upshot of all this was that the two chief desires of men, that the earth should produce crops and that women should produce offspring, became intellectually confused into a single mystery, best summed up in the word fertility. The reverence and desire for fertility led to a higher social and economic status for women and to the growth of new religious ideas, quite different from the animistic religious conceptions of earlier hunting peoples. These new ideas are usually associated with the belief in an earth mother goddess, whose confused powers of sexual and agrarian fertility were revered for thousands of years afterward. The Neolithic garden cultures were well adapted to the adequately watered hills, parklands, and valleys of the highland zone, and with certain modifications were able to move into alluvial river valleys and across the lows and other semi-open areas of Europe and Asia. But they were not able to penetrate the grassy flatlands, both north and south. In many places, these flatlands were too arid for Neolithic cultures. In more humid regions, the grassy sod was too thick to yield to hoe culture. But, above all, most grasslands were inhabited by savage, warlike hunting peoples, struggling for the right to live from the grass-eating herds of the flatlands. In the north, these herds were mostly horses and cattle. In the south, they were mostly antelope, camels, and asses. In both cases, crop planting and the peasant way of life were excluded, but the domestication of animals and, later, the use of metals were not excluded. In the period before 3000 BC, both of these diffused from the highland zone to the flatlands of Arabia and of the Trans-Caspian steppes. Thus, at the dawn of history, the peoples of those areas had made the shift from Stone Age hunting peoples to Bronze Age pastoral peoples, while retaining and even intensifying their warlike patriarchal social system. And naturally, their linguistic and physical characteristics remained as before. In order to explain these linguistic and physical characteristics of the three-zoned sandwich of Western Asia, we must go much more deeply into the prehistory of the peoples involved. This will require some speculations about the origins of these peoples before they arrived in their respective areas of Western Asia. In order to handle these problems, we must have a chronological system that will permit us to organize the population movements that brought these peoples to the places they occupied at the dawn of history. Such a chronology can be established in terms of climate changes. Once again, we must begin with the better-known present and work backward into the less known past. On the oversimplified picture of the northwest quadrant as a three-zoned geographic pattern, we should like to superimpose an equally simplified climate picture of a six-zoned pattern. This pattern is most clear on the western, oceanic border of the northwest quadrant and is modified considerably farther east by the influence of high altitudes and continental landmasses. From north to south, the six zones are: 1. Arctic, 2. Cyclonic rainfall, 3. Mediterranean, 4. Desert, 5. Subequatorial, 6. Equatorial or tropical. The nature of these zones is well known, but the influences that they have exercised throughout history on the matrix of civilizations is not generally recognized. The Arctic, or polar climate, is one of almost permanent frost. South of it, the zone of cyclonic storms has adequate rainfall, coming from the west and equally distributed throughout the year. The third zone, the Mediterranean climate, and the fifth zone, the subequatorial climate, are both transition zones and have rain in half of the year and drought in the other half. They have the significant difference that the Mediterranean zone gets rainfall in the winter with drought in the summer, while the subequatorial has the opposite experience with rain during the summer and drought in the winter. The fourth zone, between these two, is a region of permanent desert, while the sixth, or southernmost zone, of tropical climate has excessive rainfall throughout the year. The zone of equatorial rainfall is the area of low atmospheric pressure directly below the vertical rays of the sun. Because of the seasonal tipping of the Earth on its axis, this area of vertical rays and of rainfall moves northward as far as the Tropic of Cancer in June and southward as far as the Tropic of Capricorn in December. It is this northward extension of the tropical area that creates the subequatorial zone of summer rains in latitudes otherwise desert. The northern belt of adequate rainfall, associated with the eastward moving cyclonic storms, also moves northward and southward with the sun, forcing the Arctic zone northward in the summer and forcing the desert zone southward in the winter. This desert zone, holding a position between the cyclonic rainfall zone of the north and the equatorial rainfall zone of the south, is the area that is never reached by either of these rainy belts, while its northern and southern edges are reached by one or the other in opposite seasons of the year, to create the two transition zones, Mediterranean and subequatorial, that we have mentioned. Since the rainfall of the northwest quadrant comes generally from the Atlantic in the west, the eastern portions of the quadrant have much less moisture, even in the cyclonic and equatorial zones, and it is frequently quite inadequate in the two transition zones between these. This really means that the desert zone in the middle widens considerably as it stretches eastward, and that the eastern portions of both the southern flatlands, Arabia, and the northern flatlands, Kyrgyz steppe, are generally desert. The seasonal changes with which we are familiar are caused by the annual tipping of the Earth on its axis. As a result of this, the Arctic and cyclonic rainfall zones move southward and then return northward, giving us winter followed by summer conditions in the northern hemisphere. For reasons we do not yet understand, this movement southward of the first two zones was greatly exaggerated and long maintained on 4 separate occasions during the last 900,000 years. By greatly exaggerated, we mean that Arctic conditions extended southward as far as the highland zone, while the cyclonic storms followed tracks across the southern flatlands over what is today the Sahara Desert. By long maintained, we mean that these exaggerated winter conditions continued for tens of thousands of years, probably for as long as 75 100,000 years at a time. These periods of extreme cold are known as the glacial ages. There have been 4 of these glacial ages of Europe in the vicinity of the Alps, although probably fewer in some other areas. In southern Germany, where they have been most studied, the 4 glaciers have been given alpine names: Gunz, Mindel, Riss, and Würm. These names are sometimes applied to the glacial periods in other areas, although it will be just as convenient to speak of them by numbers from 1 to 4. The periods between the glaciers, when there were temperate or even semi-tropical conditions in Europe, are called interglacial periods and are also numbered. The period in which we live, following the 4th glacier, is known as the post-glacial period, or more technically, as the Holocene. If we were to assume that a 5th glacial period might occur in the future, it would probably be more accurate to call the Holocene, in which we live, the 4th interglacial period. Each glacial period lasted for about 75,000 years. The interglacial periods were not of uniform length, the 1st and 3rd lasting for about 150,000 years, while the 2nd, or Great Interglacial, lasted almost twice as long. If we add together the lengths of the 4 glacials, the 3 interglacials, and the post-glacial, we obtain a total of about 920,000 years. This period of something less than 1,000,000 years happens also to be the period in which man, in a biological form, somewhat like our own, has been on this earth. The whole 1,000,000-year epoch is called the Quaternary Age, while the major portion of it, during which the glaciers were advancing and retreating, is known as the Pleistocene. During the glacial periods, when Europe was under Arctic conditions and the Sahara was under pluvial conditions, the former was an undesirable place for human residence, while the latter was well adapted to man. In the interglacial periods, when the pluvial zone had moved northward and the Sahara had become desert, Europe was a desirable place for human habitation, while the African flatlands became almost uninhabitable. For this reason, the pluvial and the interpluvial periods of African history are even more significant than the contemporary glacial and interglacial periods of European history. In effect, man followed the pluvial zone north into Europe and south into Africa 4 times during the Pleistocene era. Of course, the movement of people was considerably less than this implies. In reality, relatively few persons followed the rain belt north and south, and these moved so slowly that they were probably unaware that they were moving. As Africa became drier with the approach of the interglacial period, the grass became scantier and grass-eating game animals fewer. The human population, which had increased substantially there in the preceding, more lush pluvial period, dwindled in number and moved both northward and southward in search of more adequate hunting grounds. The majority, unsuccessful in this search, perished, either from lack of food or in combat with other tribesmen for control of the diminishing hunting grounds. Those who moved south mostly died in an effort to deal with the inhospitable tropical jungles. Those who moved northward had a similar fate along the southern shores of the Mediterranean seas, except for the comparatively small number who could find a way northward across Sinai and the Levant to the highland zone and the northern flatlands beyond. It has been suggested that the glacial age tied up so much water in the form of ice on the northern land surfaces that the level of the ocean fell sufficiently to create land bridges between Europe and Africa at Gibraltar and Sicily. It is quite true that sea levels were considerably lower during the glacial periods, but it is doubtful that this was ever sufficient to open trans-Mediterranean land bridges, at least for any very long time. This whole process of population growth and movement was reversed at the onset of a glacial period. In the preceding interglacial age, the population of Europe, especially on the grassy northern flatlands, must have reached a maximum because of the adequate supply of herding game animals, while in the southern flatlands, desert conditions must have reduced grass animals and men to a minimum. As the advancing glacier moved southward, preceded by the pluvial zone, living conditions in Europe worsened and population became reduced, either by immigration or by death, while the population of the southern flatlands, largely from more successful biological reproduction, increased. It should be clearly understood that all these great changes took thousands of years and occurred so slowly that the individual persons involved could have had no realization that they were concerned with the processes we have described. They knew nothing of moving glaciers or rain belts and had no glimmering conception that they were one generation in a family line that was migrating successfully or was perishing locally. This is clearly one case where the historical events we describe were occurring to statistical masses rather than to isolated individual persons. Although migration was only a minor portion of the population changes of the Pleistocene, we may picture the glaciers as a great piston that advanced and withdrew 4 times, expelling population from Europe as it advanced and sucking it back again from Africa as it withdrew northward. This fundamental but oversimplified picture must now be modified by 2 other considerations. The first of these arises from the fact that glacial advance came down altitudes as well as latitudes, while the second arises from the fact that such glacial movements were not steady but fluctuating. When we say that glaciers advanced down the altitudes as well as down the latitudes, we mean that glacial advance not only consisted of a southward advance of the polar ice cap, it also consisted of a downward extension of the snow line on mountain peaks. The latter movement, on the northern side of the mountain ranges like the Alps, Caucasus, and Himalayas, appeared as a northward advance of ice. More significant for human history is the fact that the lowering of the snow line closed mountain passes, while the lowering altitudes to the north were still habitable, thus trapping groups of people north of the mountain barriers in the face of the advancing ice age. These trapped peoples were able to survive only if they could adapt their social customs to living under glacial conditions. This would have required, as a minimum, the acquisition of fire and the use of clothing. Since these people would have been separated from the main stock of mankind in Africa for a long period, at least 100,000 years, it is almost inevitable that they would have become changed in physical features, and that these changes would be those such as shorter neck and limbs, chunkier body, thicker hair, narrower nostrils, protected eye sockets, and other modifications helpful in living under Arctic conditions. The development of such a distinctive type of man did occur, at least once, probably in eastern Asia north of the Himalayas, during the 2nd or 3rd glacial age. This type is called Neanderthal man. Neanderthal man was so different in appearance from most modern men that no observer would be likely to confuse them. His bodily proportions were quite different, since he had shorter legs and almost no neck. There were other, more technical differences. His rib bones were rounder rather than flattened, as ours are. He had no real chin or forehead. His eyes were protected by bony eye ridges along the brows, and his head was attached to the front rather than to the top of the last vertebra. Because of these differences, Neanderthal man is frequently regarded as a different species from modern man, or Homo sapiens. but he is more correctly regarded as a variety, since the critical mark of species difference, inability to interbreed to produce fertile offspring, was not true of the Neanderthal and Homo sapien types. It is now generally recognized that these two were able to interbreed and leave descendants on those rare occasions when they encountered each other along the margins of their customary habitats. Such encounters were on the margins of their ranges because Homo sapiens lived under temperate conditions, while Neanderthal man lived under semi-glacial conditions. They both lived in Europe, but at different times. Homo sapiens retreated to Africa when Europe was glacial, thus abandoning Europe to Neanderthal man, while the latter retreated northeastward toward Asia, where he had originated as the interglacial period commenced. Just as we associated the movements of Homo sapiens with the movements of a glacial piston that ejected him from Europe or sucked him back from Africa, so we could associate the movements of the same piston with Neanderthal man, who came into Europe with the glacier and retreated with it toward northern Asia when it departed. Because of the conceit of normal egotism, it is customary to regard Homo sapiens as of higher intellectual capacity than Neanderthal man. This is a matter on which real evidence is scanty. But the evidence that is available would clearly indicate that Neanderthal man was at least as intelligent as Homo sapiens. This evidence includes the following. Neanderthal man possessed both fire and clothing, necessities for glacial living, before Homo sapiens did. He seems to have buried his dead, leaving with the body equipment needed in some future life, at an earlier period, thus giving evidence of an earlier recognition of spiritual values. His tools were frequently made in greater variety and with somewhat greater skill, and include the earliest compound tools, in which the blade and handle were separate pieces. But these achievements, which might be interpreted to indicate a fairly high level of brain power, apparently do not indicate sufficient mental flexibility to permit Neanderthal man to survive the ending of glacial conditions. By adapting his way of life so successfully to glacial conditions and to the pursuit of the great glacial mammals, such as mammoths, Neanderthal man made his way of life too rigid to permit him to exist under post-glacial conditions when such mammals became extinct. We have suggested that Neanderthal man developed as an offshoot from the main line of human evolution by being trapped by a glacial age north of the mountains in Asia. We do not know whether the glacier that did this was the second, Mendel, or the third, Riss. But it is clear that Neanderthal man was alone in Europe during the early portion of the fourth, Würm Glacier. The fourth glacier had two icy peaks known as Würm I and Würm II. The interval between them, known as Aachen, occurred when the glacier withdrew part way and then returned with full intensity in the phase called Würm II, or Boole. The withdrawal of Würm I gave rise to the usual population movements that we have posited of a glacial retreat. Neanderthal man withdrawing toward Asia, while Homo sapiens began to move to Europe from Africa. With the return of Würm II, this process was reversed, but this time, probably for the first time, some Homo sapien groups were able to remain in Europe under glacial conditions by adopting the techniques of fire, fur clothing, and cave dwelling that had been developed by Neanderthal man. Thus, for the first time, especially during the early stages of the withdrawal of Würm II, Homo sapien and Neanderthal man came into close biological contact, with consequent interbreeding. This occurred on the fringes of Asia and Europe, north and east of the Mediterranean Sea, and may have occurred south of the sea in parts of North Africa. As a consequence, the early post-glacial period found three human types in the northwest quadrant: Neanderthal in northern Europe retreating toward Asia, Homo sapiens in the southern flatlands moving toward Asia and Europe, largely by way of the Levant, and a mixed group in between, chiefly in the highland zone of the Caucasus and Iran. It is probable that we owe the latter existence of a stocky, round-headed, agglutinative-speaking people in the highland zone to the existence of this mixed group. This does not mean that the mixed group stayed in the highland zone. They undoubtedly moved along it, both east and west, even before the final glacial withdrawal began. Then, as this withdrawal became definite, this mixed group moved northward and eastward, hunting reindeer and cold-loving animals. They were following on the heels of the pure Neanderthal, who was moving in the same direction, closer to the glacier's edge, and still hunting mammoths, mastodons, and other glacial fauna soon to become extinct. At the same time, other mixed persons remained in the highland zone and its adjacent parklands, hunting such temperate animals as deer, elk, and the great European wild cattle. This last group we may call by the name Alpine men, a term which refers to their physical type. They spoke agglutinative languages, of which the only surviving remnants are Basque and certain archaic languages of the Caucasus. The other mixed group that followed the reindeer northeastward were of a similar physical type, but may be called by the linguistic term Proto-Finnish. These were the linguistic ancestors of the Ural-Altic languages, such as Finnish, Turkish, Magyar, Mongolian, and probably Chinese, now greatly modified by new vocabulary and the isolation of the meaningful syllables whose gluing together is one of the chief features of agglutinative languages. These languages are frequently called Ural-Altic because they were centered in historic terms in the area between the Ural and Altai mountains, just east of the center from which the Indo-European inflected languages dispersed. The early post-glacial dispersal of agglutinative-speaking roundheads on the heels of the departing Neanderthal was soon disrupted by the arrival of a new wave from Africa. During Verm II, the Sahara grasslands had built up a fairly numerous population of the familiar Mediterranean physical type, long-headed, slim-boned, rather dark-skinned, with dark eyes and hair. The appearance of post-glacial arid conditions in the central Sahara split this group, pushing some southward toward the southern grasslands of the sub-equatorial climate zone, and driving the rest northward toward the retreating belt of cyclonic storms. The group that moved southward, mixed with earlier travelers in that direction, became darker-skinned and taller, while remaining long-headed, giving rise to Negroid groups. The group that moved northward eventually crossed the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant. Those who remained in Arabia became the ancestors of the long-headed, slim speakers of inflected languages, whom we call Semites. Those who continued northward across the Caucasus into the northern flatlands became the ancestors of the long-headed, slim speakers of inflected languages, whom we call Indo-Europeans. The latter group, the Proto-Indo-Europeans, moved slowly northwestward, becoming taller and paler-skinned as they moved. They drove a wedge of tall, inflected language longheads between the agglutinative-speaking Proto-Finnish to the northeast and the agglutinative-speaking Alpines in the highland zone to the south and southwest. At a fairly recent date, in the northwestern extremity of their ranges, these intrusive Indo-European speakers became very tall, blond, fair-skinned, and blue-eyed in that Scandinavian type known as Nordic. Their ancestors remaining on the southeastern steppes stayed much less Nordic in physical type, since that type is an extreme aberrant, probably caused by the lessened amounts of ultraviolet radiation in the cloud-shrouded northwestern sunlight. Thus, in the immediate post-glacial period, during a rather dry and cold climate, the northwest quadrant had 7 different types of peoples distributed in rough bands from the extreme northeast in Asia to the extreme southwest in Africa. These bands were the following. 1. Neanderthal, moving to extinction on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. 2. A mixed group of agglutinative-speaking roundheads, moving eastward across Asia at a rather high latitude and leaving behind the ancestors of the Ural-Altic peoples as well as those of the Mongols, Eskimos, and American Indians. 3. The long-headed inflective-speaking Proto-Indo-European group moving northwestward from the Kyrgyz steppes toward Scandinavia, where it would develop into the Nordic type. 4. The highland-zoned Alpine, an agglutinative-speaking roundhead. 5. The Mediterranean type, an inflective language longhead on the northern fringes of the southern flatlands. 6. The Negroid, a tall longhead, resident in the subequatorial grasslands and the edges of the equatorial forests. And 7. The Pygmy, a very short, yellow-skinned roundhead, living in the equatorial forest itself. Of these groups, the oldest by far is the last, since the Pygmy goes back to a very early period, considerably before the 6 other types had developed, and probably shares in that remote period a common ancestry with the group from which the glacial entrapped Neanderthals emerged. If we leave aside the Pygmy as an ancient aberrant created by isolation in a sunless hot climate, and widen our field of geographic concern for a moment to include the whole Old World Hemisphere, we might make 3 observations. In the first place, the Old World linguistic pattern, in the terms we are using, is fairly simple. At the center, as a recent emergent from the southern flatlands, we find a great core of inflected languages, divided into 2 main groups of Semite and Indo-European. Around this core, as an earlier emergent from the same prolific southern flatlands, is a band of agglutinative-speaking languages, also divided into 2 groups, the Ural-Altic and Central Asia, and the Bantu of grassland Africa. And last, at the 2 extremes, in the far east of Asia and in the west of grassland Africa, are 2 blocks of isolating languages that probably arose from the syllabic disintegration of the oldest agglutinative languages. It might be added that at the dawn of history, about 3000 BC, this pattern was further complicated by the highland zone block of agglutinative speakers separating the 2 inflective groups, the Semites and Indo-Europeans. One of the great events of the historic period has been the linguistic submergence of these alpine agglutinatives by the long-headed inflective speakers, especially by Indo-Europeans, as a consequence of population movements engendered by 2 acute dry spells of the historic period. Our second observation is concerned with Africa. The earliest post-glacial climate period, called the Boreal, about 14,000 to 6,000 BC, was dry and cool. Its dryness resulted in the depopulation of the African flatlands, already mentioned. In the subsequent wetter period, known as the period of Atlantic climate, 6,000 BC to 3,000 BC, there was a movement of population back into the area, chiefly from Arabia. The people who moved westward across Africa under these influences are called Hemites. Later, in the subsequent drier period, after 3000 BC, A second and larger movement from Arabia into Africa was made by Semite peoples. Both of these peoples had profound influences on the Negroid peoples of the African grasslands and on the complex mixed peoples of Egypt and Ethiopia. Our third observation is concerned with a group that is now linguistically extinct and may appear to many as of little historic significance. These are the agglutinative-speaking Alpine peoples of the Highland Zone. This group, which usually receives only passing references in most histories, are in fact the most important group of humans who ever existed. They were the inventors of agriculture as we know it, using the same crops and domestic animals we have today. They were also the inventors of metallurgy, copper, bronze, and possibly iron, and were the founders of the first civilization in the valley of Mesopotamia. From these last remarks, it must be clear that climate change continued to determine the chronological pattern of events even in the post-glacial period. This is correct. Following the boreal period, 14,000 to 6,000 BC, we find great cultural significance in a period of warmer and drier climate from about 2,500 to about 1,000 BC. This period, called the subboreal, was preceded and followed by periods of more adequate rainfall. The earlier of these, known as Atlantic climate, lasted from about 6,000 BC to 2,500 BC, while the later, known as the subatlantic, lasted from about 1000 BC to about AD 200. In these two periods of more plentiful rainfall, the northern and southern flatlands, especially in Arabia and on the Kyrgyz steppes, had a more plentiful supply of grass and thus supported more numerous herds of grazing animals and larger numbers of men. In the intervening subboreal period, as well as during the drier period after AD 200, for about 1,000 years, the increased drought reduced the grass and the grazing herds and forced the tribesmen who lived off these to migrate out of these flatlands toward the highland zone and the Mediterranean. One of the master patterns of the chronology of post-glacial human history in the northwest quadrant was this four-stage sequence of climate change that saw each of two periods of adequate rainfall and relatively sedentary populations, followed by a period of inadequate rainfall and devastating tribal migrations. The explosive qualities of the two drier periods following 2500 BC and AD 200 were intensified by the fact that the earlier periods of adequate rainfall, following 6000 BC and 1000 BC, had greatly increased the density of population in the flatlands, and thus intensified the movement of peoples when the climate finally became drier. It should be noted that the dates given for these climate changes are those that apply to the northern flatlands, and thus to Eurasia, and that the corresponding changes in the southern flatlands of Sahara Arabia occurred a little earlier. The most notable consequence of the subboreal dry period following 2500 BC and of the post-classical dry period following AD 200 has been the outpouring of peoples from Arabia and from the areas around and to the east of the Kyrgyz steppes. During both dry periods, the peoples who moved out of Arabia are called Semites. In the earlier dry period, the peoples who moved out of the northern flatlands were Indo-Europeans, while those who moved out of this area during the later dry period were Ural-Altic speakers. The Semites who moved out of Arabia because of the subboreal and post-classical dry periods did not emerge in any constant or steady stream, but rather came in waves. These waves went in three chief directions: 1. Southward into Africa, 2. Westward into the Levant, Palestine and Syria, and 3. Eastward into Mesopotamia, Iraq. We shall say nothing more about the ones who went into Africa, but those who went into the Levant and Mesopotamia are too significant to be neglected, even in the most cursory examination of Old World history. These two areas together form a semicircle, open to the south, around the Arabian desert and called by the breasted the Fertile Crescent. This crescent, like a great horseshoe curving northward, has its western leg resting on the head of the Red Sea near Aqaba, while its eastern leg rests on the head of the Persian Gulf. Any movement of peoples out of Arabia by land would be into the Fertile Crescent. There have been 4 such waves bringing newcomers either into the Levant on the west or into Mesopotamia on the east. Although these immigrants were quite closely related to one another, they are usually known by different names in the 2 halves of the Fertile Crescent, even in the same outward movement. The first wave of immigrants into the Levant just before 3000 BC are simply called Semites, while their brothers who moved eastward are called Akkadians. In the Middle Valley, and Assyrians in the Northern Valley. The second wave just before 2000 BC are known as Canaanites in the Levant and as Amorites in Mesopotamia. In the course of the second millennium BC, various branches of these 2 groups became distinguished in different areas, so that some of the Canaanites came to be known as Ugarites, Phoenicians, and Hebrews, while some of the Amorites came to be called Babylonians. The third wave out of Arabia brought people known as Arameans in the Levant and as Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. The fourth wave, which began about AD 600, were known as Arabs in both areas. The chronological relationships among these various groups of Semites can be seen in the following tabulation. 3000 BC, Levant, Semites, Mesopotamia, Assyrians north, Akkadians south. 2000 BC, Levant, Canaanites, Mesopotamia, Amorites. 1000 BC, Levant, Arameans, Mesopotamia, Chaldeans. AD 600, Levant, Arabs, Mesopotamia, Arabs. Naturally, movements of these Semite peoples outward from Arabia had profound effects upon the history of civilizations. The Canaanites became the chief element in a civilization of their own, known as Canaanite civilization, which lasted for almost 2,000 years, ending with the destruction of Punic culture by the Romans about 1000 BC. The Arabs also came to form a distinct civilization called Islamic, which lasted about 1,400 years and ended with the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in the 20th century. The other peoples named Akkadians, Amorites, Arameans, Chaldeans, and Assyrians played varied roles in the most venerable of civilizations, Mesopotamian, which originated in the activities of a non-Semite people, the Sumerians, and ended with the imperial achievements of another non-Semite people, the Persians. While the Semite peoples were emerging from the Arabian desert to play the roles we have mentioned, even greater activities were being performed by the Indo-European peoples who were emerging from the drying northern flatlands. These peoples pushed out from the flatlands in 2 waves, of which the earlier are called the Bronze Age invaders, while the others, 800 years or so later, are known as the Iron Age invaders. These 2 waves shortly after 2000 BC and again shortly before 1000 BC were both results of subboreal climate changes and consisted of Indo-European speaking peoples. A third wave after AD 200 contained a considerable number of other Indo-European speakers, notably the Germans. But the original impetus came from the pressure of Ural-Altic speakers. Of these Ural-Altic speakers who pushed out of the Asiatic flatlands after AD 200, the earliest were the Huns. These were followed during the next 1,000 years by other Ural-Altic speaking peoples such as the Avars, Bulgars, Magyars, or Hungarians, Mongols, or Tartars, and Turks. A chronological table showing the movements of the Indo-European peoples in the 2 earlier waves originating from subboreal climate is by no means as simple as it might be, because these movements sent peoples into many geographic areas, in each of which they are known by a different name. The earlier or Bronze Age invaders about 1800 BC originated in the flatlands north of the Caspian Sea and sent peoples into areas extending from Central or Western Europe to India. The later or Iron Age invaders about 1100 BC originated northwest of the Black Sea and sent peoples into areas from Central Europe to Palestine, but not farther east. As a result, we must include in our table 9 different regions as follows. Locality 1. Central Europe. Bronze Age invaders. Battle Axe peoples 2000. Iron Age invaders. Celts 1400. Locality 2. Italy. Bronze Age invaders. Terra Mar 1700. Iron Age invaders. Villanovans 1100. Locality 3. Greece. Bronze Age invaders. Achaeans 1800. Iron Age invaders. Dorians 1200. Locality 4. Anatolia. Bronze Age invaders. Hittites 1900. Iron Age invaders. Lydians, Phrygians 1200. Locality 5. Egypt. Bronze Age invaders. Hyksos 1600. Bronze Age invaders. Peoples of the Sea 1194. Locality 6. Levant. Bronze Age invaders. Mitanni 1900. Iron Age invaders. Philistines 1190. Locality 7. Mesopotamia. Bronze Age invaders. Kassites 1650. Locality 8. Iran. Bronze Age invaders. Persians 1900. Locality 9. Bronze Age invaders. Aryans 1700. In Europe itself, the 3rd millennium BC, especially the latter half of it, saw the most important changes in all Europe's history. The preceding period of warm, moist climate had continued for over 300 years and led to the growth of thick forests that broke up the human inhabitants into small, isolated bands, dwelling in the rare open sites on the banks of rivers or on the shores of lakes and seas. The herds of grass-eating animals almost disappeared, and the highly successful Paleolithic way of life in which man was a hunter of big game was replaced by a sedentary way of life in which man was a gleaner, a fisherman, or a hunter of small game in wooded terrain. This new way of life, known as Mesolithic, lasted about 3,000 years, 6,000 to 3,000 BC, and was also found on the western fringes of Asia and the northern fringes of Africa, where the increase in rainfall was also evident. This Mesolithic culture is regarded by most writers as a retrogression from the much more dramatic big game hunting of an earlier period, but it seems to me that this is a mistaken point of view. It is also generally considered to be a local European development, which seems to be equally wrong. My own opinion on the Mesolithic is that it was a period of progress to a higher culture, in terms of technology and human productivity, and that it was not a local invention, but rather came in from the tropical forest zone, where a somewhat similar way of life must have existed for a considerable period. There is no space here for the rather technical arguments that would support this theory of Mesolithic diffusion from a tropical forest area, but it is possible to mention the kind of evidence that would be used. In a pinhole cave in England, just at the level where the Mesolithic evidence begins, was found an Indian Ocean cowrie shell. Obviously, if a shell could come that distance, some of the new techniques of Mesolithic culture could come the same route. Or again, Europe's first domestic animal, the dog, whose origins seem to go back to Southeast Asia, arrived just at the beginning of the Mesolithic period. This animal, well adapted to small game forest hunting and to the sedentary trash accumulating life of the Mesolithic, could have come by the same route as the cowrie shell. Moreover, in the very late Mesolithic period in Europe, there appeared two other domestic animals, the fowl and swine. Both of these are of Asiatic tropical forest origin and thus have quite a distinct source from the later highland zone domestic animals associated with early peasant agriculture. These later animals, such as sheep, goats, and cattle, are grass-eating, highland-zoned herd animals, and are not tropical forest gleaners, as are the chicken and pig. Mesolithic technology had a much reduced concern with stone tools and a greater increased concern with fiber cords and wickerwork. It included fish lines and fish hooks, nets and wires, snares, bowls and arrows, permanent huts of wicker and mud, or, as the English say, wattle and daub, basketry, canoes and paddles, and toward the end of the period, 4000 BC, crude pottery, and even some crop planting. The evidence for this new Mesolithic technology, which has recently been described by J.G.D. Clark of Cambridge University, is often to be found in shell heaps and trash mounds, kitchen midden associated with the Mesolithic's sedentary settlements. At the end of the 3rd millennium BC, this Mesolithic way of life was disrupted by a series of events that pushed European societies forward to new economic levels. About 2700 BC, a cultural movement from the Levant or southern Anatolia had arrived in southeastern Spain by way of the Mediterranean. This movement, sometimes called the megalithic movement, brought to Europe a number of cultural innovations, of which the chief was the use of metal, copper, and bronze. From southwestern Spain, near Almeria, these innovations spread to Europe by two subsidiary routes, while the megalithic movement went on to Western Europe by sea, crossing the Atlantic waters and the Bay of Biscay to Brittany, 2500 BC, and the narrow seas to Britain and Denmark, 2200 BC. Groups of Spanish origin, called the Bell-Beaker people, moved northward across the Pyrenees and southern France to northern Italy, Switzerland, and Central Europe by land. At the very time that the megalithic and Bell-Beaker movements were bringing metals to Europe from the west, the Neolithic garden cultures were bringing highland zone peasant agriculture to Europe from the east. This innovation first appeared, according to the available evidence, in the western Asiatic highland zone, possibly near Armenia, in the 7th millennium BC, as we have already indicated. The search for fertile plots in semi-open parklands resulted in a steady diffusion of this culture and its peoples. Crossing Anatolia and the Aegean Sea, they were in northeastern Greece by 3500 and then proceeded by way of the Vardar-Morava route to the middle Danube, while some descended the river to Romania and Bessarabia, where further passage was blocked by the warlike hunters of the steppes. Others moved upstream across the lower lands of Hungary to Austria, the shores of Swiss lakes, and the upper Rhine. Down the Rhine, they proceeded to the lower valley, whence they fanned out, going eastward across southern Germany and westward across northern France. By 2200, the latter branch had crossed into England, and within a few generations, the Central European branch was moving into Denmark from the south. In this way, both agriculture and metals had penetrated to Western and Central Europe before the onset of subboreal climate brought in Bronze Age horse-using Indo-European warrior peoples from the eastern steppes. The arrival of these new people and of drier subboreal climate led to a drastic reorganization of Europe's societies. The climate change by 2000 BC opened the forest of Europe, so that megalithic traders abandoned the seaways of the West in all of southwestern Europe as far east as the Adriatic and as far north as Brittany, and instead crossed Europe by boat on the rivers, bringing Irish gold, Cornish tin, and Danish amber across Bohemia and southern Germany to the Danube. Down this river they went to the mouth of the Morava, where they split, some continuing down the Danube, while others turned south to the Isthmus of Corinth and the Gulf of Argos beyond. In Argos, the new commercial cities of Mycenae and Tiryns welcomed the northern traders and grew rich from their commerce, which continued on by sea to Crete, to Egypt, or to the Syrian saddle. Those traders who had continued down the Danube crossed Thrace to receive an equally warm welcome in Troy, whence the trade routes continued across Hittite Anatolia and the Assyrian outposts in Cilicia to the Syrian saddle and Mesopotamia. These European trade routes of the subboreal period were not disrupted, but were rather developed by the arrival of the Indo-European warrior peoples in Central Europe about 2000 BC. From the Neolithic peasant peoples, these conquerors extracted food, and from the megalithic traders they extracted tribute, using the surplus accumulated to exploit the bronze-making resources of Bohemia in forest forges. From this system emerged a prosperous barbaric, but not civilized culture known as the Great Central European Bronze Age. This culture reached its peak about 1400 BC, with northern and western connections to megalithic Ireland, England, Stonehenge, and Denmark, and even more significant connections to Teremar, Italy, Mycenaean Greece, and Hittite Anatolia. These southern and eastern connections were with similar Indo-European Bronze Age invaders in other areas. The whole system was destroyed by the onslaught of Indo-European Iron Age invaders about 1200 BC. These later peoples exploded out of the northern Balkans with devastating force and established in various areas the Celtic speakers of Central and Western Europe, the Dorian speakers of Greece, and a variety of Anatolian peoples such as Phrygians and Carians. In the Aegean and Balkans, these Iron Age invaders ended Cretan civilization forever and established a Dark Age that lasted for several centuries. This Dark Age, centering on the period 1000 BC, marks the transition between Cretan civilization and its descendant classical Mediterranean civilization, performing a double role as the period of invasion of the former, stage 7, and as the period of mixture of the other, stage 1. Farther east, the same Indo-European population movements performed different roles in other civilizations. In Anatolia, the Bronze Age Hittite invaders who came in over the Caucasus across Armenia acted as stage 1 of Hittite civilization, 1900 BC, while the Iron Age invaders from Thrace destroyed and ended this civilization a short 800 years later, providing the limits to the briefest and least known of all major civilizations. The Iron Age invaders of the Aegean area, whom we have called by different names in the Balkans and in western Anatolia, drove fleeing before them a mixed group of earlier inhabitants of those shores, including Achaeans, Etruscans, Trojans, Cretans, some Dorians, and various dimly known peoples of the Anatolian shore. This mixed group crossed the Mediterranean and became the unsuccessful Iron Age invaders of Egypt. In 2 amphibious assaults on the Nile Delta, one about 1221 and the second about 1194, they were thrown back by Egyptian forces under the leadership of the pharaoh Ramses III. Thus repulsed, they scattered on the Mediterranean shores to seek new homes. Egyptian pictures, which show their Viking-like ships and accompanying inscriptions, give us the most specific evidence we have of these tumultuous events. The written evidence tells us the names of some of the frustrated invaders, including in the enumeration such intriguing terms as Sarda, Sikani, and others. It has been suggested that subsequent settlements of these refugees in the western Mediterranean gave Sardinia and Sicily their names, and may have brought the Etruscans from an original home near Troy to Tuscany on the shores of the Tyrrhenian Sea. More significant for civilized history, however, was the fate of those Iron Age invaders who fell back from the unsuccessful assault on Egypt and turned eastward to land on the more weakly defended coasts of Canaanite Levant. This group, known to us from biblical records as Philistines, gave their name permanently to the area we call Palestine. 8 centuries before the Philistines came into the Levant from the west by sea, Bronze Age invaders had come down into the Levant from the north by land. This was part of the great flood of Indo-European pastoral peoples who broke over the Caucasus from the northern flatlands about 1900 BC. As this flood crossed Armenia to enter Kurdistan, it split into 3 branches. The branch that turned sharply west into Anatolia became the Hittites. The branch that continued south underwent complicated changes. Originally Indo-European, it pushed ahead of it a large mass of highland-zoned round-headed agglutinative speakers who are frequently called Hurrians, and these, as the flood continued southward, began to push before them a mass of Semite-speaking peoples. Of these peoples, the advance guard, largely Semite, invaded Egypt, where they are known as Hyksos. The middle mass, chiefly Hurrian, spread over much of the Levant, and are frequently mentioned in the Old Testament as Hurai, Hivites, or even Hittites. The driving rearguard of this movement, mostly Indo-European, settled on the Syrian saddle as exploitative tribute gatherers and breeders of horses for much of the Near East. They are known as Mitanni. An offshoot of this migration, more Hurrian than Indo-European, moved down into Mesopotamia and set up numerous local kingships known as Kassites, 1650 to 1300. These peoples were gradually absorbed into the basically Semitic population of the river valley over the next few centuries. East of Mesopotamia, where the later Iron Age invasions did not reach, the influence of the earlier Bronze Age invasions are well known. In the first 3 centuries of the second millennium, these peoples moved southward and eastward from the Caspian steppes. Those who settled in Iran were known later as Medes and Persians, but played no great role in history until the 6th century BC, when they took over political domination of Mesopotamian civilization from the Chaldeans in the last stages of that civilization. Further east, the Bronze Age invaders of India, known as Aryans, destroyed the Indus civilization and instigated a period of turmoil that was stage 7 of Indic civilization and stage 1 of Hindu civilization. The events described in this chapter, performed on the 3-zoned northwest quadrant within a chronology based on climate changes, form the matrix in which the earliest civilizations evolved. These events, examined in detail with careful attention to brief periods or to small areas, probably seem very confused. But organized in terms of the whole history of the quadrant during the Quaternary Age, as we have tried to do, these events begin to assume relatively simple patterns. During the Pleistocene period, there came into existence the triple-layered linguistic and physical pattern that we have described. During the Holocene, this pattern was somewhat complicated, but the chief event was the invention of agriculture, metallurgy, and civilized living by the highland zone peoples, and the subsequent linguistic and cultural submergence of these peoples by inflective-speaking, long-headed pastoralists pushed in waves from the flatlands by the 2 post-glacial dry periods. One of the chief results of this process, a result seen perhaps most clearly in Europe, was to create a political and social structure in which patriarchal, warlike, horse-loving, sky-worshipping, honor-seeking Indo-Europeans were established as a ruling class over peaceful, earth-loving, fertility-dominated, female-oriented peasant peoples. This pattern, first established in Central Europe almost 4,000 years ago, was not destroyed, in spite of Rome, Christianity, and later migrations, until the appearance of industrialized urban society in the last 4 generations. If you enjoyed this recording, you can find more and support the production of these works at my website, johnlothe.wordpress.com. That's www.johnlothe.wordpress.com. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe.